Please welcome Stan Garfield.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you all for turning up early here today for this. Hopefully you'll find that it was worth getting up early and coming and joining us for the next 45 minutes. And the first thing they're asking me is, do I want to? I do not. Okay. So these are the 60 myths that I'll go through, we'll cover today, and I encourage you to think about them as they go along. If you've seen the same thing, or if you have a different view, I hope that you'll stand up and say, you're wrong, so we can have some interaction. So let's start with the first one, which is the notion of push. Now, it's an interesting thing. I work at Deloitte, where John Hagel is also the head of our Center for the Edge, and he's written a book called The Power of Pull. But it's not like everybody always follows that religiously. We still have a lot of people who love to push things out, namely the idea that if only we publicize it, advertise it, promote it, force it into someone's mailbox, etc., that this will work, that people will read it and do whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do. So among the variations that you'll see, promoting banner ads on the internet, or sending out frequent emails or frequent reminders, and then telling you that you need to do this, or remind you to do that, or pleading with you to complete some profile or submit some document or use some tool. And the problem with push is it's gotten worse over the years, is that we're so used to seeing this kind of thing that we just tune it out. So if you receive an email and it isn't one that you specifically were looking forward to getting, or it's not from someone that you consider to be important, or it's not on some subject that's relevant to you, your general inclination is to ignore it, delete it, get rid of it, automatically filter it into a junk folder, whatever. So this notion of that we can push something and that will work is less and less valid. And we ironically will lament that we get too much email, but yet we'll still rely on it. So the same people that will say, I get too much email, I don't want any more email, you'll find that, well, they only use email, or they only send email out and they don't use other alternative ways. But the notion is that it's a lot better to try to create pull, demand for what you have to offer, than if you try to force people. And that includes a lot of things, and we'll talk about that in one of the other myths about making people do things. But the message here would be, figure out ways to get your message across in such a way that it's not forced on someone. If you can make it appealing, if you can make it in a place that people can choose to consume it, that's a better way to get people to read it, understand it, take whatever action you want, than if you try to force it on them. This one has several varieties. Someone else will do it. It starts with leaders who initiate like a CAM program, and then they'll leave it to others and say, okay, you take it from here, I'll do something else. Or people who work in knowledge management, but who don't lead by example. They want everyone in the organization to use a particular tool or to follow a particular process, but then they don't do that themselves. They figure someone else will do that. So they may say that we should use an enterprise social network, but then they continue sending email. Or they say you should fill in your profile, but then they have someone else fill in their profile. And you'll run into this kind of thing when you're encouraging a leader, let's say, to interact in an enterprise social network, or to do something using one of the tools, and they'll delegate that to someone else. They'll say, you fill in my profile, or you post for me, or you ghostwrite for me, and things of that sort. And we can all sense that when that's happening, right? You can't really get away with that without people realizing it. So if you really want someone to do something, one of the very best ways to do it is to do it yourself. And then not only will you learn about how it works and the pros and cons of it, but other people will also see you doing that, and they'll see, okay, you're doing it, so they'll do it as well. Another version of this is the notion of benchmarking competitors. We see that a lot. Well, we've got to benchmark our competitors so we can do what they're doing. I mean, it's valid to find out what other organizations are doing. It's value of a conference like this. We hear from each other. We can learn, and we can innovate on what we hear from other people. But if you only want to do exactly what other people are doing, then you're really just leaving it to someone else. You're not thinking about what's good for our organization. You're saying, well, we'll do just exactly what someone else does, and that's not really going to be very innovative, or it may not even be relevant to the problems that you face. Another one is not really wanting to get your hands dirty by learning by doing. Sometimes when a new tool comes along, the people who are trying to promote it have to be the first ones to jump in and try it. And it can be messy, and it may not work right, it may be hard, but the point is if you don't do that, and then you're turning around and talking about it, that's not a good thing. we see this a lot when it comes to getting people to use knowledge management tools by asking them to post in an enterprise social network or contribute documents or anything that requires them to sort of take a risk, but we think someone else will do it, right? So we are all familiar with the general rule of thumb that says about 90% of any community will tend to read or be more passive in a community, and there's 10% that's more active. Well, if the 90% never post anything at all, if they never contribute anything at all, then obviously our knowledge sharing programs aren't going to work. It's like if we go a search and we don't find what we're searching for, we can blame the search engine, but more often than not, it may be that the thing you're searching for isn't there. And why is that? Well, someone didn't contribute it. So it's this notion that somehow things will magically get done so we can take advantage and we can have supply without anyone creating it. We'll just search and find it. Or someone else will ask the question that I was thinking of asking, but I'm afraid to ask, and then I'll benefit from that. But if that doesn't happen, then no one ever learns. So we've got to be willing to do it ourselves as opposed to expecting someone else to do it. And this notion of demand without supply. I want to just be able to get whatever I want. I regularly receive requests, you probably do too, where people are asking some very, very specific thing. I was just looking at one right now before I started, and they wanted all kinds of very specific information about, send me best practices for KM and a product company and ROI data and so forth. And it's a notion that everything is just out there somewhere and that we will just magically find it. But if someone hasn't supplied that, it's going to be sort of hard to find. Now, I've written a bunch of articles, and in each one of these slides there's a link to it. So the slides are online, you can access them there. But the articles that I've written sort of relate to each one of the 16 myths. In this case, a recent one which fits the theme of this conference about being agile, not fragile, talks about many of these concepts. And another one has to do with, do you need deep knowledge in order to lead? And that one is relevant as well. It relates to the idea that can you lead a knowledge management program without actually knowing much about knowledge management, or can you lead one without actually doing it yourself? And my point of view on that is that you really can't. And if you haven't done knowledge management before and you're put in charge of it, then I would suggest that you really invest a lot of effort learning about it as fast as you can, rather than sort of sitting up above and saying, well, I'm the chief knowledge officer and other minions can worry about that and I'll just be, lofty, high-level executive. I don't think that works out as well. So for more on that, I encourage you to read my article about deep knowledge. Here's one we all have heard and recently came back to life again, which is the notion that KM is dead, or it's on life support, or it's irrelevant, or whatever term you want. We hear this a lot. In fact, I think we've been hearing it pretty much for the last 20 years. So not only was KM sort of born in 1995, but a year later it was being asked, was it dead? And along the way, so was everything else that we use. We'll hear that email is dead, but it doesn't seem like it is. We still seem to get lots of it. Social business is dead, but whatever it is, it just seems like that's a way to generate interest in a point of view or sell a product or sell service. You can make a claim like that, and it would be provocative, and people will tend to pay attention to you. So recently there was an article that Tom Davenport published about this, where he was claiming that knowledge management has sort of become irrelevant, and that generated a lot of comments, a lot of response. So I wrote an article in response to that. The one at the bottom is knowledge management on life support. And I try to take an objective view of that, and that there are some negative indicators that have occurred over the years. It's not like everything is 100% perfect, but I think there's more positive indicators than there are negative indicators. The fact that we continue to hold KM World and we all come to it, the number of people that sign up to attend the workshops and participate in the sessions, the number of different people every year that are presenting, that's one sign. The number of times that I get asked about knowledge management doesn't seem to go down. So something is going on that continues to sustain it. It may not be rapidly growing in size, but I think it's clear that knowledge management is not dead. The needs for knowledge management, I don't think will ever go away. Whether we call it that or something else, will we continue to need to share and innovate and reuse and collaborate and learn? I think we always will. And so that's why I don't think the idea that we won't need knowledge management anymore is not an accurate view. What I think is dead is some of the older notions that we started out with. So when we started out 20 years ago, we focused more on collection and getting document repositories created and measuring things like website visits. And there's still some of us that are worrying about that same thing, but I think that's the thing that's on the way out. And the newer connections and communities and collaboration. That's kind of where we've evolved to, but some organizations are still trying to catch up to that. One of the other points has to do with the name for knowledge management. There's always people saying that we shouldn't call it knowledge management, we should call it something else. And in one of the slides that I present in my workshop, I show there's 50 different names that I've had people suggest for it. They all have some validity to it. There's nothing wrong with any of it. But I think that we're still calling it knowledge management. I think we still will call it, whether it's good, right, or wrong, doesn't really matter. That's the label that's stuck. So I think spending a lot of time talking about what we should call it probably isn't as helpful as worrying about how to do it better. We also hear from people that incentives don't work. I've heard this as long as I've been in the field, but yet my own view is different. I view that incentives do work, and I've developed incentive systems that I think have worked quite well and have been adopted by other companies. But the notion is that people will game the system. So we had a point system that I developed when I was at Hewlett-Packard and awarded points for knowledge-sharing behaviors. And theoretically, it could have been gamed. It would have been easy to game it because you got a point for every time you posted in a threaded discussion board. We had one instance of that. One person who would tend to post in the discussion board with some trivial comment like, great, thanks. And eventually I just approached that person about that. And after that, he was never seen in the forums again. So it's self-correcting. You know, if people do this in the open and enterprise social networks, everyone else is going to see that and they're going to appreciate it, and you'll hear back. So I don't think gaming the system, at least in my experience, was a problem. Another one is that people aren't really motivated. Intrinsic motivation is more important than extrinsic motivation, and rewards wear out and so forth and so on. And there's probably some truth to that. But what I saw was that there was actually great response to when we actually added an incentive component to our point system. And I think it's not only because they could earn some money, which everyone likes to earn, but I think it was more important that it signaled the importance of the effort. When they saw that the chief executive was backing up this program with financial element, they said, this must be important, therefore I probably should be doing it. So to me, knowledge management incentive programs have worked. If you want to see some examples of them in working today, you can look at IBM and Accenture. And the KM STARS program, which we've written about, is documented, and you can read more about it. But I encourage you, if you've heard this notion that people won't be motivated by incentives, to revisit that. We hear a lot of talk about rolling out a tool or driving adoption. Who here has ever heard those terms? We all run into that, and I always kind of cringe when I hear that. Rolling out a tool implies that we have a tool that's in search of a solution. I mean, we don't know why we're rolling it out. We're just rolling it out. So someone will acquire a new tool. In the early days of SharePoint, for example, they'd say, we want to roll out SharePoint. They wouldn't explain why or what it was going to be used for. It's just the tool itself. And today we'll hear that with enterprise social networks. We want everyone to start using our enterprise social network. And they'll use some sort of vague terminology like, we want everyone to start collaborating globally. We want everyone to make connections. We want everybody to interact. But if you don't get more specific than that, that's not a very appealing use case. If you say, will you please start collaborating globally, it doesn't mean anything to me. But if you say specifically what you want them to do, and that image there of the giraffe, that's our acronym that we use at Deloitte for the 7 uses that we recommend for our enterprise social network. If you say that you want them to share, ask, find, answer, recognize, inform, and suggest, and then you go into a little more detail about each one of those use cases, now people can relate better to that. And you can have a conversation with them about the last time you wanted to share something, what did you do? Did you share it in email? How did that work? Last time you had a question, what did you do? Did you ask the person sitting next to you? How did that work? So you can interact on the specific use cases, and then you can talk about how the tool that you're wanting them to actually use does that better. But if you just make it this vague thing, that you're rolling it out, we're driving adoption, and that doesn't generally work too well. And then there'll be the one-time special events. Like when we rolled out our enterprise social network, we had a big fanfare and we had a 24-hour rolling online jam and so forth. But that sort of thing sort of wears out, and people can be skeptical about that. What's all this about? Instead of relating it back to these 7 uses, if we were just trying to have a lot of hoopla and hype over it, people will tend to tune that out. So I would say don't talk about driving adoption or rolling stuff out. Instead, talk about how can we make it clearer to people what the advantages of using tools are. We've probably all heard the notion that social is frivolous, or social is not serious, or it's a waste of time. And that's where we had a discussion yesterday where one of the speakers said that you don't want to call your enterprise social network Facebook for the enterprise. And that's probably a good suggestion, because a lot of people will conjure up something different than work if you talk about social in that sense. And some people even say to avoid the word social altogether. And they'll tend to give you the example of, well, I don't care what you ate for breakfast. Now, I don't actually see a lot of posts about what people ate for breakfast. So I don't think that's the primary use of social media, but that's common lament. So that's once again where you have to sort of get back to your use cases and say, no, we're not really talking about sharing what you ate for breakfast. We're really talking about these other uses that are valid, in which the social tools do better than other previous tools. But then there's the notion of wasting time. I've even had cases where people have told me I was chastised for using the social network to post something. I was told to stop doing that and go back to work. And so we've got some work to do there. If that's what's viewed as being wasting of time, I think you can turn that around and say, well, what were you supposed to do instead? So the time that people spend on social networks, if they're truly sharing useful information for the rest of the organization, if they're truly using it to ask and answer questions, we have to recognize them and celebrate that, and not make them think that somehow that's a waste of time. And so in this Wordle that you see here, this is the article I wrote about collaboration use cases. You need to once again back to the specifics about, here are the use cases for all of this and why these make sense and why they're a benefit to the individuals and to the organization. In the community realm, we often get into a debate about whether we should try to control or not the creation of communities. And there's not agreement on this. I have one position. There are other people that have opposing views. But my own view is that there's actually value in trying to limit the number of communities that any organization has. There are a lot of reasons why that is, but the counter-argument is we should let 1,000 flowers bloom and use survival of the fittest. So if there need to be 100 different communities all focused on social media, that's fine. One of them will emerge, and that's the way it should be. Well, my own experience is if you have 100 communities for social media, they'll all die. So none of them is going to thrive. There won't be the survival of the fittest. There'll be the death of all of them. And why is that? It's because when someone goes to try to figure that out, and they say, okay, I want to go and learn about social media, and they look to see the available communities, and they're shown this bewildering list of let's just call it 10. There's 10 communities to choose from. They'll just give up. They're not going to go pick one. They're going to give up. Or if they do pick one, they'll miss lots of other people that would have benefited from it, or people that could have answered it. So the notion that we should allow there to be an infinite number of these things, in my experience, doesn't work well. It's better in this instance, not necessarily to control everything, but in this instance, I think control has value. And so therefore, I would say limit that, get groups to combine, keep your community such that it's easy for the user to figure out which one, to have a critical mass where all of them can be together. And the notion of don't control, I would say in this case, and specifically in this case, is that you should control, you should try to prevent redundant communities, but it's not because you're trying to make some kind of top-down authoritarian control. It's rather to respect your user, to give them an easy-to-understand environment where they know which community to join, and all of the people can reliably be expected to be in that community. Eliminating risks. There are companies that are very sensitive to risks. I work at one of them, and there are plenty of other ones. And they're concerned that we may somehow share some information that we shouldn't share. Information will be leaked somehow. And in some cases, I've seen where they tried to control all access to the outside world. We had some instances where countries would say all access to social tools are blocked. And why was that? Well, because we're going to control leaking information that we don't want to leak. Now, the interesting point of view on that is that if you had a social network and it was open, then you would be aware of if such a thing was happening because you'd see it, it'd be visible. But if you don't allow that, what happens? People do it some other way that you don't see. I mean, you can't prevent somebody from handing a piece of paper or sending an email or having a phone call or some other means. You can't necessarily control that. But yet you're thinking, well, if we block social media, that'll be the answer. So it's actually better to encourage things to be shared where you can see it and it's visible. And if somebody does something inappropriate, you can then talk to them and take an intervention. Whereas if you drive it underground, it doesn't work. So what my own view is to trust people to do no harm. It doesn't mean that people won't do harm. They may do it intentionally or unintentionally. But if they do it in such a way that you can see it, then you can counsel them and you can intervene. But if you don't, then what? If you don't trust people, then it's a fundamental question about why did you hire them? People are working for a company, you hire them, you entrust them with the work that they're doing. You should entrust them to use good sense also when it comes to sharing information. Now, you've probably seen some of these humorous instances. This one was taken from a slide share that you have a link to at the bottom where it was called this new technology, the threat to our information, and it turns out they were talking about the telephone, because the telephone we can't control and monitor and so forth. So they were saying, oh, we've got to ban the telephone, but let's drive all of our sharing to wikis, blogs, and forums, because every entry is named and attributable and corrected and wrong. So it's humorous, it's tongue-in-cheek, but its point is a very, very good one, and I think we should really reconsider this notion of trying to control and limit risk, and instead trust more, do things more openly, and then correct when you have to. Has anyone here ever been asked why your search isn't more like Google? Probably. And we all know sort of the reasons why that is. It has to do with scale and difference between the millions of people on the internet and the thousands or hundreds of people in your company. But you'll still hear about that. And so you'll even hear leaders who say, well, let's make our search just like Google. The other one you'll sometimes hear is, let's have content ratings like Amazon. And that's another one of those things that doesn't work well when it's not at scale. So the number of people that actually rate things on Amazon isn't a very large number, but because there's so many people, it's large enough to matter. But inside of a company, the percentage of people that might actually rate a document is tiny. And typically what we've seen is there's only two types of people that would actually give a 1 to 5 star rating on a document. The person who wrote it, who will give themselves 5 stars, and someone else who has some axe to grind with them who will give them 1 star. But you won't get a useful rating. And why is that? Well, my own experience, if I'm asked to come up with a 5-star rating, it's hard. I have to struggle with, is this 3 or 4 or 5? So I won't do it. And so I think that that's the wrong thing. It's better to ask simple questions, such as, were you able to reuse this document? That's a yes or no question. That's an easier one to answer. So if you click, it's like the like button. If you click the like button, you don't have to think too hard about it. You either like or you don't. If you like, you click like. But if you have to think as if 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, that's a different dynamic. So I like things like saying, click here if you were able to reuse this document. Now that's a very objective statement. You either were able to reuse it or you weren't. And if one is clicked a lot like that, then you can say that's probably a document that we'll want to promote or have it higher in search results and that sort of thing. So think about how these things actually work behind firewalls inside of companies and treat them differently than saying this should be just like Google or just like Amazon. Often here, the reason for doing something is we need our own. So I'll be asked, can I have a community for SAP? And then I'll say, well, we already have one. Why don't you just use that community? Well, I need my own. And that isn't always well articulated as to why, but that's generally some variation of we need our own. And the idea could be for what they think is a valid reason. It could be we need one just for this country that we're in. So I'll get that one. I need one. I need a knowledge management community just for Portugal. And I'll say, is knowledge management that different in Portugal than it is in some other country? Now, if they wanted to have conversations in Portuguese, that might be a valid reason. But if they were going to talk in English, but they wanted just for the people in Portugal, then the problem with that is, A, there aren't going to be that many people in it. B, they're going to miss out on all the other knowledge management people in the other knowledge management community. So what you're trying to do there is to try to encourage them to say, you don't really need your own, and try to refocus the energy that they have to start their own new community into helping to lead the existing one. So that the best advice there is to say, I'm glad that you're excited to lead this new community. Let's have you be a co-leader of the existing one. We can really use your energy and you bringing in your colleagues from the organization you're in, as opposed to trying to get a new one off the ground, which likely isn't going to go well. We also see that with internal versus external. The notion that we'll have an internal community or an internal forum or an internal repository, when in fact, most of the wisdom about the subject may be outside of the company. So you'll see that sort of thing in a community that's formed where people ask some question that could easily be answered if you were part of an external community, but can't be answered that easily inside. I had an example of that this week where someone wanted to know what were the job descriptions for knowledge managers at our competitors. And they asked that inside of Deloitte. It's a hard question to answer inside of Deloitte because we are not our own competitor. But if they ask that question in an external community like the SIKM leaders community, they're likely to get some answers. So the idea that we can only do this inside, we don't want to do it outside, it often isn't going to be effective. And then there's the notion of the narrow niche. This is the one where I need a community, I need a enterprise social network group for this module of SAP. And they'll localize it even further. So if it's going to be for Europe, and it's module 12 of SAP. And we say, well, I don't think that's going to achieve critical mass. There aren't going to be that many people that you're going to find. I know you're excited about it, but you may be the only one. And so you're going to form your community. And we've seen this thing where they form their group, and they write an initial post, and they say, hey, everyone, we're going to talk about module 12, and they're the only member of the group. So no one is actually seeing their excited post. So part of it is helping them to understand and educating them and guiding them. But the other thing is to help them to see that when you don't get critical mass in a community, you generally don't have an active community. And my colleague Lee Romero, sitting here, did some work where he studied inside of our network what the number was, what number of people you needed to have for a community to be likely to be active. And that number turned out to be 200. So if you had 200 or more, you had more likelihood of an active community. And if you had below that, you had less. It doesn't mean that there aren't counterexamples. It just means that on average, if you don't get to that magic number, it's not as likely. So when you see that kind of thing happening, you want to go that direction. Typical lament is that I don't have time for a variety of things. I don't have time to do the thing you're asking me to do. I don't have time to participate in communities. I don't have time to be on calls. I don't have time to go to conferences. And what that implies is they don't think that learning is as important as mundane tasks. So if you said, why didn't you attend the community call this week? Well, I had other stuff to do. Well, what exactly is that other stuff to do? Often it's attending some meeting, or it's doing some kind of some mundane work. And if you back away from that and you say, if we're in the field of knowledge management, and one of the things we're really trying to strive is to learn and get better at things, won't we do that ourselves? Won't we make 1 hour a month to learn more about our field? But instead, we kind of get consumed by this. And no one's making you do. No one's making you learn. No one's making you attend a conference. But when you do, you generally are going to be better at it. So the notion that you don't have time generally means I don't think it's important. And you should probably step back and reevaluate that. The other thing what you'll run into is that people will want to plan and prep sort of endlessly rather than try things out. So they'll say, well, yeah, we should probably do that, but let's develop a plan, and there'll be an endless planning cycle, and we'll start up a task force. And then instead of just doing it, and my advocate is always just try it. So you see the cartoon here, we don't have time to change the wheels, push harder, Harry. So we're so busy with our mundane, dreary work that we don't realize that we could be doing something else. We could step back and figure out a better way that would actually end up saving us time. Frequent thing that I hear is that we should work ourselves out of a job. This variation is that knowledge management's everyone's job, so therefore we don't really need knowledge management as a department. We don't really need to be full-time knowledge managers. Our goal should be to not even need knowledge managers anymore. So when I hear that, I always say, what about finance, HR, and operations? Is it their goal to work themselves out of a job? Are we going to get rid of the finance department because finance is all of our jobs? And I think this is a fundamental mistake. It's all of our jobs to actually share and learn and do the things that knowledge management includes. That's true. But for anything to actually get led in an effective way, there actually needs to be somebody leading it. So to say that there'll be no one leading knowledge management and everyone will just do it is naive. And it's not that you need a gigantic knowledge management team, but I always say you need at least one. You need at least one person who's worrying about this, and you may need a few more. So when you say it's everyone's job, it is everyone's job to do it, but it's not everyone's job to be the advocate for it, to be the champion for it, to be shepherding all the people, process, tool components that go into knowledge management program. So I don't think we're trying to work ourselves out of a job. What we're trying to do is more ingrain knowledge sharing into the work of everyone else, but not necessarily to eliminate the people trying to lead the effort. So this org chart here is an example of a simple org that I use in my KM 101 workshop, but if you have to have an organization and you have a few people and somebody's leading people and somebody's leading process and someone's leading technology and then you have some extended virtual team members, that may be all that you need. You don't necessarily have to have some monolithic giant structure, but I think you need something in order to shepherd knowledge management. So bigger is better. large teams. The bigger team we have, the better. The more power I'll have, the greater importance I'll have in the organization. I'll be measured by that. So we'll build up large teams. We'll develop large offshore presences. And we'll think this somehow signifies that we're important or doing good work. But large doesn't necessarily mean more effective. In fact, if you think about it, many times the larger you get, the less effective you get, because you're spending all of your time coordinating and communicating within these many, many people. And if you get down to a smaller number, you have to spend less time doing that. So large isn't necessarily better in terms of teams, and large isn't necessarily in terms of anything else. If the more websites you have isn't necessarily the better. We've heard some instances where people said they had organizations with millions of web pages. I doubt that that's a good thing. Or dizzying websites with lots of crazy stuff on them, animation, widgets and things. The more the better, the cooler the better. Well, actually, as Google showed when it came onto the scene, simpler was better. The initial Google interface was just a box in the middle of the page. Meanwhile, the previous champion, Alta Vista, had evolved to have all kinds of things. It had every kind of information known to mankind on the page, but that wasn't what people were wanting. They wanted something simpler. So more is not necessarily better. Sometimes we'll tout the fact that we have more ESN groups. Look at this. We've got 606 new groups this week. Well, as I said before, that's not necessarily good. That could be bad. So more isn't necessarily good. And then you have the problem of citing numbers that don't necessarily reflect reality. And that is we have join-only members. People join a community and then they don't pay any further attention. And we can tout that we have 1,000 members of our community, but how many of them are actually even paying attention to what's going on? Now, the exception to this is the more members who are paying attention, the better. So I never found any reason why a size of a community needed to be limited. Sometimes people ask me, isn't there an optimum size, or shouldn't you try to keep it small? No, my own experience and the research that Lee did suggests that no, if you have 1,000 members in a community and the 1,001st member joins, that's not going to cause any harm. That 1,001st member may begin learning and benefiting from the other 1,000 members. They may be able to answer questions and share useful information. There isn't any harm in it. So in the case of community membership, more is better. The notion that we could make people do something is naive. We'll make them maintain their expertise profiles. How many people have been able to successfully make someone maintain their expertise profile? It's not something we tend to like to do. Or contribute all documents. Early days of KM was contribute all your documents, and then we'll put them in a repository, and then we can reuse all of them. And no one likes to do that. Dave Snowden, of course, has written about the volunteer, not conscript. The idea that we can make somebody do something is not valid. And if we make them do it and we enforce it, they'll do it to the minimum extent possible. So forced membership in communities isn't a good idea. Those should be voluntary. Or the notion that everyone's going to start from one homepage, that's naive. Here's our intranet homepage. We're going to put a banner ad on there because everyone will go there. No, they won't. They're going to bookmark some other page and go there, and you're not going to be able to determine where they go. So don't try to. Instead, once again, back to the power of pull, try to pull them in. And if you need to locate expertise, an alternative to that is, instead of making people fill in their expertise profile, is to let them join communities and let the expertise emerge in the community. And so once again, there's an article I wrote about that you can refer to. My work is primarily in communities and in collaboration, and I always hear community used in sometimes strange ways, but everything is a community. So sometimes I hear entire populations are referred to as a community. Well, my own notion of community is that it's a voluntary group that you join because you want to get better at something, not something that defines the organization you're in, or it's not just defining the ethnicity that you have or whatever. There's all these odd notions of community. To me, community is you choose to join because you want to meet up with other people who are similarly interested in the same subject. So that means that a community is not a website, it's not a wiki, it's not a blog, it's not an ESN, it's not an organization, it's not a project team. It's truly just the people that choose to learn more about a subject by coming together. And I've written more about that in the Communities Manifesto. And then this is the final of the 16 myths, and that is that our intellectual property will be stolen. So I can remember many a discussion inside of companies that I've been at where they'll say, we've got to lock down this content because some other part of our company will use it in the wrong way. So as an example of that, I was at a company in which we had a consulting division and we had a field service division. And the field service division was realizing that it needed new sources of revenue because maintenance was a declining revenue stream for computers. And so their notion is we better get into new services. The consulting business then was wary. If we publish any of our materials that we use to deliver services, this field service business is going to steal that, and they'll go out and deliver those services, and we'll lose revenue. So let's make sure that we make this accessible only to consulting people. And, of course, that's not very realistic, because a field service technician in possession of some project plan from a consultant is probably not likely to be able to go out and deliver that consulting service. What's more likely is that they'll come to the person that posted it and say, I see that you posted this document. My customer wants to buy that. Can you help me deliver that? I mean, that's more likely. So the notion that you need to lock it down, you need to secure it so other people can't see it, it kind of goes against the whole notion of knowledge management. And one of my more recent articles about this, which I call Open the Gates and Tear Down the Walls, is this notion of the private group or the lockdown content. And then you contrast that with the notion of what we're all trying to do, which is get people to share and to be more open in that sharing. You have to step away from that and say, why are we doing that? And sometimes, well, we're going to prevent competitors from getting it, or we're going to prevent disgruntled employees from getting it, or whatever. Now, there are legitimate reasons why you might be working on a project team which needs to limit access to the project team's content. That's fine, but that's a little bit different than some broader community or broader knowledge repository. And I think it's reasonable to say, if you're encountering that, is to step back from it and say, is there truly a risk that we're dealing with here, or is it imaginary? Just like this notion that our IP will be stolen and reused, when in fact they would probably be more likely to call us in. So those are the 16 myths. I'm interested if you've observed, how many people have seen any of those 16 that we went through? Does it resonate with anybody? Does anybody have a differing view they would like to offer? I'm perfectly open and willing to hear it. It's not that I think that I'm right and you're wrong. That's my view. But what are some other views someone would like to offer? Yes.
I had the chance to be with you on Monday, and then also had the chance to listen to Philip from Denmark, and he spoke about utilizing wikis and whatnot. So I guess your first myth, push it. I would agree with you in whole entirely as far as breaking down the traditional way of doing things. Philip, though, he kind of encouraged whatever discussions, I guess, used to be happening in email, they moved the wiki. And I had the chance to go over to Matt first, and I said, so are you using how do you guys use email now? And he goes, only for messaging and notification. And there's not the discussion. So once the discussion happens, say, hey, put it on the wiki. Because we want everybody to see it. So, but he is using email for messaging to say, hey, something's happening here. You might want to look.
Yes. Okay, that's a good point. So the point was there's still a need for email, even though you might move from the collaboration inside of a wiki or an enterprise social network. Am I advocating that not use email at all? No, I'm not. I mean, email does have exactly the value of it's a perfectly good communication tool. But in that case, what you want to say is that you want people to sign up for that email, so they opt in. So I'm all in favor of email for people to choose to use it. So some people don't like email and they can use it another way, and some people prefer it. I personally still use email a lot, and I like getting notifications, but I have colleagues who don't. But to me, if you choose to opt in and get email, that's fine. But when email arrives unwanted, that's what I'm saying I don't like. So if I sign up for a group and I say, give me email notifications, that's good. But if I get push notifications, like here's the daily digest, and I didn't want that, then I'm saying don't do that. Yes?
So regarding the subject matter experts, like including them in the community. So when we include them in the communities, how do you control them so they don't take over the whole community? And the other members in the community are intimidated by their presence. So how do you balance that?
So the question is, if you're in a community and you have subject matter experts there, how do you avoid them intimidating the rest of the community? Because they're always the ones answering with their authoritative tone of voice, and everybody's scared away. Well, that's a valid question. Of course, when you start a community, you're probably hoping you even get to that state, because initially there's no one answering anything. So you take that for a start. But then later, you do want to make it so that people feel safe and comfortable and not drowned out by the so-called self-proclaimed experts. In a case like that, you would have to do a combination of talking to them and letting them understand how maybe they should hold back and not answer immediately and let someone else answer first. Also encouraging and recognizing the people who aren't the so-called experts who do. So I like to really always, thank someone who posts in a community and they're not there. I'll thank them. Thank you very much for posting here, or thank you very much for answering here. We really appreciate that. So that kind of recognition. But if you sense that somebody's really doing it, then I would have a conversation with them and say, we really appreciate your help. We really rely on you, and it's great that you're active in the community. But how about the next time the question comes in, pause for maybe an hour and see if there's some other answer. And if so, then praise that answer. And that'll encourage it rather than you having to answer. Any other questions or comments? Well, I'll conclude by saying if you want more information, here's the link in the deck. You'll have a link to my site. I mentioned the SIKM Leaders Community. You're all welcome to join that community. We've been around for 10 years. We have a monthly call. We had an annual dinner here at KM World on Tuesday night. And we have online discussions, and it's a great place to get your questions answered. And then I encourage you to read my LinkedIn posts. Many of them are linked to in this document, but they're all there, and you can go and take a look at what I have to write. And I encourage you to do the same. Start using LinkedIn for your own writing. I think it's a great way for us to share our knowledge. So thanks very much. I appreciate your time.